Welcome everyone to our monthly meeting, and it's a particular pleasure to have Rehan Durmaz speaking to us from the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and she's going to introduce us to a very interesting combination of texts, one a piece of Christian hagiography and the other the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's a most marvelous link up of two, at first sight, completely disparate texts. So let me hand over to you, Rehan.
Thank you very much, Professor Brock. Thank you so much for having me today. It's such a pleasure, honor, and I'm extremely excited to be here with you all. So as you mentioned, I'll be reading a couple passages from this text right here. It is titled The History of the Great Deeds of Bishop Paul of Kentos and Priest John of Edessa. I will first say a few words about this text, and then I will read some passages. Then we will move to the Arabic passage that Professor Brock just mentioned. And then I want to think out loud with you about the relationship or potential relationship between these two texts and what we can say in light of this example about shared stories between different religious communities in the early medieval Middle East. So the story of Paul and John was probably written sometime in the early 5th century in Edessa, because it frequently refers to the Bishop Rabbula and Edessa, the blessed city, and the main character, Paul of Kentos, moves from Italy to Edessa and lives in Edessa, returns to Edessa. So we can contextualize this text as a product of Edessan hagiography. It is not a very famous text. When we talk about, for example, late antique hagiography, we tend to think about the life of Simeon the Stylite, the life of Saint Anthony of Egypt, life of Thecla and Macrina, and other very famous holy men and women. And Paul and John's story is not very well known in relation to them, but it has very interesting relationships with other well-known stories, like the life of men of God and Martyrs of Najran. So despite not being very well known itself, the story is related to those important hagiographical texts of the Syriac milieu in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond geographically. So without further ado, I will start reading the text. So just to situate us in the story, in the first 10 paragraphs of the story, Paul first is born in Italy, and then quickly he moves to Edessa from Italy, and he does not reveal his clerical title or his sanctity to the community, so he lives in hiding. He works as a builder in Edessa, and his custom is to just work as a builder during the week, and then one day a week on Fridays he goes into the desert and he prays. That's his own day outside the city. Otherwise, he just works as a builder. So now we are reading a passage in which he meets his lifelong companion, John. So one day, virtuous Paul went out to pray in the mountains in solitude. Blessed John stole away after him to see what he was doing. He saw that he ascended the mountain to the south of the city and entered an isolated cave there and knelt in prayer before God. John stood outside and his tears flowed down, seeing the great serenity that God gave to those of his household. After Blessed Paul had been praying for a long time, a great serpent came creeping along and came upon him from a den inside of the cave. The Syriac text has the word tanino for the great serpent. John, when he saw the serpent from outside the cave, started to shout and said, my Lord, behold, your adversary comes upon you to do you harm." But Paul ignored him and did not rise from his prayer. At that moment, John saw lightning come down from heaven. It entered through the mouth of the cave and struck that serpent and mangled it. And then Paul rose from his prayer and said to John, "Why, my brother, did you shout when you saw that adversary of our race? And who directed you to this place? You are indeed a true disciple of Christ." And this is how they meet during Paul's prayer in hiding. John was first hiding, and then when the serpent is about to attack Paul, he cannot contain himself anymore, and he shouts. And that is the beginning of this lifelong spiritual companionship for Paul and John. After that, these two holy men travel to the Holy Land, to various places in Syria. They just leave Edessa with the permission of Bishop Rabbula, and their travels begin. And here I will jump a few passages to passage 23. They are now at Mount Sinai. Hereafter, the saints blessed one another, and Paul and John traveled courageously to the mountain of God. And it came to pass, when they had arrived at the base of Mount Sinai, that a band of Arabs came upon them. They seized them and brought them captive to a certain place that was named of the Himyarites. When they came to the camp, they bound the saints and set them down in a tent. Then they said, "These men will be sacrifices." God wanted to instruct his servants, and he certainly did not abandon them into enemy hands. For in the middle of the night, a certain young girl cried out from inside the tent and said, woe is me, arrows of fire fly out from these men and strike me in the face." And the parents of the young girl were awoken by her voice and asked her what caused her shouting. She cried out all the more and said, "Fire issues forth from these men and strikes me in the face." Blessed Paul said to her, "Do you want the fire to stop striking you? Believe in our Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall live forever." And at once she ran over and released the blessed men from their bonds and said, "Yes, my Lord, whichever God delivers me from this suffering, in him I will believe." In passage 25, we read about how Paul prays over this woman, this tormented woman, and he baptizes her. He baptizes many in the community, and there is this communal conversion. In passage 26, we read about what happens after this communal conversion in South Arabia. Then the news of what had happened was brought to the king. When he had heard it, he was greatly enraged and at once sent mighty warriors. They seized the many who had come to believe, both men and women, 70 souls in all. They bound them in chains and imprisoned them. As for the blessed men, they cruelly tied them up and brought them out of the camp to a certain place where there were many palm trees, from which the entire camp was fed. Amidst the palm trees, there was one tall palm, very lush in its branches and fruits. They brought them under the tree in order to sacrifice them, the two holy men. Then Blessed John stood up and said, "Ruler of this world, permit me to speak. What do you think this tree is, which grows so rich in its branches and fruits?" The king said to the Blessed One, "It is the God of the camp." And John said to him, "Well, then gather up your whole army and bring it here. And while your God stands in his place, we also will call our God, and they will do battle with one another. Whichever God wins, his camp shall be delivered from the sword." Then the king said, "You have spoken well." Then the Blessed John waved his hand towards the palm tree and said, "Our Lord Jesus Christ, fruit of mercy, you who by your will make all the cedars of Lebanon grow, send your wrath upon this tree and utterly uproot it, so that the many will not worship it in error. At once, a wind struck it and pulled it up from its roots deep in the earth. Its branches and fruit immediately withered away, and all of it was consumed as if by fire. So this dramatic scene narrates how tree worship stopped in this camp in South Arabia. And after this, there is the communal baptism and quite lengthy quotations from the Bible. And this conversion is narrated quite dramatically in this story of Paul and John. Shortly after that, Paul and John leave South Arabia and decide to go back to Edessa. And I think this is 2 passages after. Yes, in passage 30, we have another story about, this time, a good tree. When the cultic tree is uprooted, quickly after that, there is a story about a tree-dwelling saint. So, passage 31, they are en route to Edessa. It happened that when they were walking along the way at evening time, they reached a mountain on top of which stood a tall tree. And there was the shadow of a man standing in the tree. When they saw him, they shouted to him from below, "Blessed, O my Lord," but he did not answer them. And Paul called out to him a second time and said, "By Christ, whom the righteous love, if you are a man, speak with us. If you are a demon, be gone from us as chaff in the wind." When the blessed man up above heard the name of Christ, he rejoiced greatly because he saw his brothers coming toward him. He said to them, "Do not fear. I'm a man like you, a disciple of Christ." John said to him, "Why did you choose, Lord, to stand on top of a tree? And how many years have you been doing this?" He said to them, "As you live, my brothers, I have stood in this position for 35 years, and no man has noticed me except the 2 men who come to me from time to time to bring me provisions of bread and water. For a journey once called me too to pass by this place, just like you. And I saw a man standing on top of this tree, a man heavy with white hair, whom they called Abraham, head of the mourners. When he saw me, he kept me with him for 3 days and told me about the struggles he had had with the defiled spirits and about the serenity his soul had received from God after his struggles. After 3 days, he surrendered his spirit to God, and I brought him down and buried him. Because my soul longed for the serenity of his soul, I climbed up and stood in his place, and I await God's deliverance. By your lives, then, my brothers, because of the love of our Lord, stay with me 3 days as well, and you will see a miracle. For the God who sent me to the blessed Abraham also sent you at this time. And Paul and John stay with this dendrite, this tree-dwelling saint, for 3 days, as he asks them to do. When the dendrite surrenders his soul, they climb up the tree, they prepare his body for burial, they bring it down from the tree, and they inherit the water pitcher that he has, and they continue to their travels. They go to Jerusalem, they go back to Edessa, the blessed city, and the story continues for another about 12 passages, and they separate from each other in northern Mesopotamia in the region of Nisibis. So the section I read for you is mostly from the earlier parts of this much longer and much longer text that has other details, and it's a very lively story and a long journey of these 2 holy men all across the Near East and beyond as far as South Arabia. So the second text that I want to bring and put in conversation with the Syriac story of Paul and John is, as Professor Brock mentioned, is one of the earliest biographies of Prophet Muhammad. We only have an edited version of it from the 9th century. It was probably put together in the 8th century. And the authority quoted here, I will read in a second, but the authority quoted here, Wahab bin Munabbih, lived at the turn of the 8th century. He died somewhere around 715, 720s. So there is quite a gap between the Syriac story of Paul and John and the Sira, or the biography of Muhammad. So comparing these texts is problematic or methodologically challenging in some ways. But I would like to just read a passage from you that was circulated. So maybe you had a chance to look at it. It's quite interesting and they resonate with each other. So I would like to talk with you and think out loud with you about what to do with these similarities. So here's the Arabic text. We are on page 14 and at the middle of that page here. Al-Mughira bin Abu Labid, a freedman of Al-Akhnas, on the authority of Wahab bin Munabbih the Yemeni, told me that the origin of Christianity in Najran was due to a man named Faymiyun, who was a righteous, earnest, ascetic man whose prayers were answered. He used to wander between towns. As soon as he became known in one town, he moved to another, eating only what he earned, for he was a builder by trade using mud bricks. He used to keep Sunday as a day of rest and would do no work then. He used to go into a desert place and pray there until the evening. While he was following his trade in a Syrian village, withdrawing himself from men, one of the people there, called Salih, perceived what manner of man he was and felt a violent affection for him, so that, unperceived by Faymiyun, he used to follow him from place to place, until one Sunday he went, as his wont was, out into the desert, followed by Salih. Salih chose a hiding place and sat down where he could see him, not wanting him to know where he was. As Faymiyun stood to pray, a taneen, 7-horned snake, came towards him, and when Faymiyun saw it, he cursed it and it died. Seeing the snake, but not knowing what had happened to it and fearing for Faymiyun's safety, Salih could not contain himself and cried out, "Faymiyun, a taneen is upon you." He took no notice and went on with his prayers until he had ended them. Night had come and he departed. He knew that he had been recognized, and Salih knew that he had seen him. So he said to him, "Faymiyun, you know that I have never loved anything as I love you. I want to be always with you and go wherever you go." He replied, "As you will. You know how I live, and if you feel that you can bear the life, well and good." So Salih remained with him, and the people of the village were on the point of discovering his secret. The next couple sentences tells about a miracle story where Faymiyun is tricked into healing a boy who was covered by his father, and then they literally have to trick him because he doesn't want to reveal his identity as a holy man, as a healer. Then they are recognized in the city, so they decide to leave, just like Paul and John leave Edessa. So I'm halfway through that page there. Knowing that he had been recognized, he left the village, followed by Salih. And while they were walking through Syria, they passed by a great tree. And a man called from it, saying, "I've been expecting you," and saying, "When is he coming?" Until I heard your voice and knew it was you. Don't go until you have prayed over my grave, for I'm about to die. He did die, and he prayed over him until they buried him. Then he left, followed by Salih, until they reached the land of the Arabs, who attacked them, and the caravan carried them off and sold them in Najran. At this time, the people of Najran followed the religion of the Arabs, worshipping a great palm tree. Every year, they had a festival when they hung on the tree any fine garment they could find and women's jewels. Then they sallied out and devoted the day to it. Faymiyun was sold to one noble and Salih to another. Now, it happened that when Faymiyun was praying earnestly at night in a house which his master had assigned to him, the whole house was filled with light so that it shone, as it were, without a lamp. His master was amazed at the sight and asked him about his religion. Faymiyun told him and said that they were in error. As for the palm tree, it could neither help nor hurt. And if he were to curse the tree in the name of God, he would destroy it, for he was God alone, without companion. Then do so, said the master, for if you do that, we shall embrace your religion and abandon our present fate. After purifying himself and performing 2 rak'ahs, he invoked God against the tree, and God sent a wind against it, which tore it from its roots and cast it on the ground. Then the people of Najran adopted his religion, and he instructed them in the law of Isa bin Maryam. Afterwards, they suffered the misfortunes which befell their co-religionists in every land. This was the origin of Christianity in Najran, in the land of the Arabs. Such is the report of Wahab bin Munabbih on the authority of the people of Najran. This is the whole passage about Faymiyun and Salih that is found in the biography of Muhammad. And interestingly, this story has been repurposed, rephrased, and transmitted across Islamic literature from this early 9th century text until 14th century. And it was placed in different genres too. I read a passage from biography, and we can find the same story in Quranic exegesis, historiography, universal and local historiography, in a dictionary about South Arabia, and in a Sufi treatise. The story there is interpreted as an exhortation on patience and perseverance. So despite not being very well known or not being as famous as some other texts in the Christian tradition, Islamic tradition has been very interested in this text, as far as we can tell from the transmission history. And it was very popular across genres, across a broad geography and time period. And this comparison, that's why this comparison is very interesting for me, because I am not sure, of course, I cannot tell that this story of Faymiyun and Salih in the Seerah of Muhammad is a paraphrase of the story of Paul and John. I think it is, but of course, we can talk about the transformation of the story between the Syriac and the Arabic versions. I think it's an abbreviated version of the story of Paul and John. And the change in the story, the way the clerical titles are erased, the way the sequence of events slightly change, and the way the names change to Faymiyun and Salih. They are all very interesting cases that tell us a lot about storytelling and how stories are transmitted across broad geographies and across linguistic and confessional boundaries. And the way Islam was very interested, Islamic or Muslim authors were very interested in this story also says a lot about inter-religious dialogue, encounter, and how these memories are recreated in different genres of Islamic literature. So the aftermath of the transmission from Christianity to Islam is also a very interesting case. Case of transmission and interreligious dialogue. So these will be my introductory notes and my reading, and I welcome your thoughts and questions and any other examples you can bring in. I'm really curious to hear your comments on these two texts that are very close to my research, and I have a lot of fun, and I'm very excited to talk about this particular case in such context with you all.
Well, thank you, Rehan, very much. This is really fascinating. And when I read them beforehand, I wasn't quite so struck by the parallelism, but when you read them out, somehow it came out much better. And it really is quite extraordinary how similar the narrative, the framework is. And I'm sure people have questions, so we are now open to questions. So put your either in the chat or put your hand up, as it were, through the reactions. So please make your questions. But while you're thinking, Rehan, how did you make this initial discovery? Because it's really very exciting.
It is very exciting, and it goes back to my studies with Susan Harvey and Nancy Kallick at Brown University when I was exploring Christian and Islamic hagiography side by side, and I knew that I was very interested and passionate about this topic. And this text, I genuinely cannot remember when I first read it, but I remember just these two resonating very closely with each other in my head. And when I look at scholarship, the story in the Sirah of Muhammad, in the biography of Muhammad, about Fimyun and Salih, has been studied by various scholars. There is quite a good corpus of scholarship on this passage, and people made connections with, for example, Apa Poimen tradition from the Egyptian desert and some other texts. But when we read this in parallel to Paul and John's story, the Dendrite episode, the South Arabian tree worship episode, and other miracle stories actually really resonate with each other. And the name Fimyun looks a little out of place, and it sounds like Poimen, and I think that's why some scholars suggested that. But my suggestion is that because the story of Paul and John has, I think, in almost all cases, has been transmitted right after the story of Man of God in manuscripts. And at the end of that story, at the end of the story of Man of God, we read about Euphemianus, Man of God's father, mentioned. So my proposal is that that story and Euphemianus became incorporated with the story of Paul and John. So there was that name confusion at some point, and I don't know if that was a confusion on the Arabic or Islamic side or the Christian side. That I don't have an evidence for, but it makes sense that Man of God story with Euphemianus and Paul and John's story, because of being transmitted together for long years in various manuscripts. I think about 8 Syriac manuscripts transmit those stories side by side. They merged at some point, and we are looking at that version in the biography of Muhammad. So the name change is actually explicable, and Salih is, of course, has nothing to do with John, but Salih is an Arabic word that means something like man of God or a beloved of God. So it's kind of a generic name, actually. Of course, it's the name of a prophet as well, but it is one of those names where you see in a lot of the transmissions, because it's such a Arabic specific name, and it's also a generic name that can be attributed to many holy men. So the name change makes sense. The stories resonate with each other. The vocabulary sometimes is really the same. The Tanin episode is an example. So I'm convinced that the story in the biography of Muhammad is an abbreviated version of Paul and John. And the more I read these stories and their reiterations in both Syriac and Arabic, the more I became obsessed with this transmission history, because it's not a one-time exchange that happened in South Arabia, but it is an ongoing story that is remembered in the Islamic tradition. So I've been talking about this for the last 4 or 5 years now.
I'm very struck by odd elements in that the narrative, which turn up elsewhere, but not in a similar context. The tree being cultic tree being destroyed occurs in the Life of John of Dailam, which is a 7th, 8th century saint, but you haven't got other elements of the narrative. And then the captivity you get in the narrative of Nilus. So these are individual elements which seem to be traveling around in hagiographical texts. They're not definitely, there's no clear relationship between them, but the tree is quite an unusual motif, and so it's rather just these floating in the air, and sometimes they come together, and the two texts that you're dealing with, they come together in a quite a remarkable way.
It is really interesting. I really like that episode, but you are right that from a Near Eastern context, they suddenly teleport to South Arabia, and that episode happens quite drastically and quite short. Actually, it's 2 or 3 passages, and then they go back to Edessa. So it is. It might be a later insertion into the text. For all that we know, it looks very odd in the narrative sequence. And you're absolutely right that John of Dailam and this text are perhaps better known for this cultic tree, uprooting the cultic tree episode. I know of only one more text that is even a more obscure text, probably later than these. It is Aho of Rish Aino, again a West Syriac text. And he uproots a cultic tree in Armenia. So I guess depending on where the cultic tree is, we can see these cultural orientations. This text is very much oriented towards South Arabia, probably because of its connections to the Martyrs of Najran tradition. And Aho's story is oriented towards Armenia because of its own cultural context. So it's very interesting where the cultic tree is, but the uprooting is pretty much a standard trope in between these texts, even if the motif, as you say, is quite rare. And I find it fascinating that right after the cultic tree comes a good tree, where we have a tree-dwelling saint, and his burial is organized by these 2 holy men. So the tree by itself is not bad. It is just the practice that makes the context an error or a very high form of holiness. So I really like how this text weaves together all of those different elements to make a very interesting trajectory for these 2 holy men.
Yes, it's the collocation of these elements and the way they follow the same pattern in the 2 texts, which is so striking and quite amazing.
It's really fascinating, because not only because it just it looks a little out of place in the Sirah of Muhammad too. That's why I'm very interested in the question of how Wahab bin Munabbih or another transmitter had access to this particular text when it comes to explaining South Arabian history. It remains to be a mystery to me, but also how this text is condensed into that form in the Islamic tradition. So something that looks a little random in the Syriac text is very much a central story for the biography of Muhammad, to explain what happens until Muhammad's prophecy, and explaining the story of Christianity in South Arabia. So I'm very much fascinated by the placement of the story in this new context with this cultic tree episode.
Yes. Now, I'm sure there must be questions and comments from other people, so please feel free to pose questions. And one of the surprising things about all this is that this text has only very recently been published, and it's been known for a long time. I was very curious myself about where the place Kanitos or Kentos, we don't know how it's pronounced, and ostensibly in Italy. Have you any ideas where the place is?
Not really, because even the translators say it might be Kentos. They don't know. It might be Kentos. It might be Pontus in the Black Sea region. But the text later on explicitly refers to Italy,
yes.
Italia. So it. And because the text is related to the story of man of God, which again begins in Italy, so somewhere in Italy, somewhere close to Rome, seems to be the case, but I don't know where Kentos is. The story is very much focused on Edessa and the persona of Bishop Rabbula and his tenure, because he keeps appearing in the text in between the travels of these two holy men.
Yes. Now, others questions?
Or if you have any similar examples,
yes,
I would also love to hear about any comparisons, of Celtic trees, or any story that you seem to have traced between Christianity and Islam. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about how this case compares to others.
And have you found any similar parallels to this, probably not so striking, between hagiographical texts and Muslim tradition, early Muslim tradition? Because
yeah, go ahead.
In a way, it's what one might expect, in that converts from Christianity to Islam, they would carry with them the memory of stories like this. And so I would not myself be surprised to find more, but it's difficult to locate them.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just to say a few words about what you just mentioned, this is such a rare case that many stories sound similar between Christianity and Islam, and we can, of course, recognize the tropes between the two traditions, Islamic and Christian hagiography. But this text is really special in that we can actually put the two texts side by side and read it side by side, and we can see some vague connection. At least it's better than many other collections that we have. But of course, Christianity and Islam have many shared saints, and their stories sound quite similar. Saint George being one of them, and Saint Anthony being another. So this is just another one of those cases. But it's very interesting how Simeon the Stylite never appears in Islamic hagiography. Anthony of Egypt is quite different than the Christian story of the saint. So this one is very interesting in preserving the Christian story as closely as possible, and that's why it's very interesting to me. Or one of the starting questions of my book was to just bring to the fore the argument of shared tropes that many scholars advocated for, and of course, as you've mentioned, many stories do share tropes. We recognize the trope, and we cannot trace any more concrete transmission between authors or communities. And this is one of the main arguments for shared stories between Christianity and Islam. Many scholars say these are just shared tropes, but this is one of those cases, one of those really rare cases where we see much more than a shared trope. Even if the story is abbreviated and significantly changed across time and place, this is not mere sharing of tropes. And this gives more agency to authors and transmitters and storytellers and people and their input into these processes, rather than just merely taking things from the air and using them for their own purposes. This is really the travels of a story in the hands of multiple transmitters and authors. That's why it's a very rare case. We of course don't know how often these things happened. In the book, I deal with multiple examples and I analyze them, and nothing comes close to the story of Paul and John. So numerically, these cases might be quite rare and much smaller than what some of us hope. But it still says a lot about the different modes of transmission. Certainly, much of the transmission happened at the trope level, but then we can speak about personas being transmitted across Christianity and Islam, where the generic contours of a hagiographical dossier or of a biography is recognizable, but the story changes. In St. Anthony, for example, that's the case where Anthony is recognizable in a text that I analyze, but the story is completely different. He's the Anthony of Egypt. He is identified as such, but the story is completely different. So the persona is transmitted, but the story is rewritten. And then in this case, we see the story being abbreviated, but preserved as it is, pretty much as it is in the Islamic tradition. So this only just gives texture to that vague notion of stories shared between Christianity and Islam that we all refer to in scholarship without really defining because of the fleeting nature of the material, of course. So I hope cases like this just tell us more about how these stories were shared on the ground level, at the level of storytellers and everyday people's language, and across these really peripheral boundaries too. South Arabia was of course a very lively place where important Christian communities lived, and Jewish communities as well, but in the studies of the Near East, it is taken as almost like a peripheral, semi-mythical place, and this story gives very much texture to the Christian and Muslim communities there at the time of the emergence of Islam.
It's another big issue. Thank you so much. Our time is up. So Rayhan, we're most grateful to you. Really fascinating. And so our next meeting is on the 20th July, and it's Kathleen McVeigh from Princeton Theological Seminary, and she's going to be talking about the conception by the year in connection with imagery of the Virgin Mary. That's a very famous image in early Syriac poetry. So until then, goodbye, and thank you so much to those who've been present, and to you, Rayhan, for speaking, and to Thea for organizing it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure to be here.
Well, it's lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you too, Professor Brock.
Good.
And thank you everyone for being here.
Yes. Good. Well, thank you.